welcome back, Sociology. In our last chapter, we talked about culture. I defined culture as the norms, values, language, and beliefs that are passed from generation to generation. But I've asked you in this class, how is the process of culture transmitted? Well, that leads us to this chapter, which is socialization. Culture is passed through socialization, and I say that culture is not just taught, it is caught. We pick it up as we go, and we pick up those things from our parents, from the media, from our friends. But if we even bring this down to a more basic conversation, sociologists contend that what makes us human, at the very least what makes us fully human, is socialization. So when we talk about how people become who they are and what makes people who they are, this leads us to a discussion of nature versus nurture. This is an ongoing debate. However, I think the technology and the decoding of the human genome have clearly showed us that the answer is yes and or both. Genetics make you who you are, and socialization. So I'm going to focus the conversation in on what do sociologists emphasize? So they emphasize nurture. They emphasize the relationships that influence you into your own personality and identity. And to do this, throughout the course of their history, they have looked at a few different cases. We can't go back in time, make a clone of you, and raise one of you in the family and separate and raise another version of yourself in another family. And so what we have had to rely on are these rare case studies. Sociologists have looked to cases where babies have been raised outside of socialization. So one of these cases is the case of Isabel. Isabel was born in Ohio. Her mother had developmental delay and was also was mute, so she did not speak, and Isabel did not have access to the human language because her maternal grandfather locked her mother and herself, locked her in an attic. She and her mother remained in an attic for 6 years. And although she had access to her mother's touch, and they would have a system for communicating and were given food, she did not learn to speak. She was discovered when she was 6 years of age, at which point she began going to school, and she would eventually make a full recovery. Another case known as Jeannie. This young lady was locked away by herself and was not discovered until she was 13. Jeannie did not make a full recovery. She remained in an institution. She would steal things from others. She would bite. So you would say that she did not make a recovery. And the age of discovery is significant. But I would say sociologists would argue what's even more significant is the fact that Jeannie did not have her mother with her. Even without speaking, socialization is critical for cognitive development, for brain development. Everything that you are really depends on socialization by your mother or a maternal figure. So sociologists have argued, what would it be like if people were not held? And what would be the improvement over a collection of youngsters who were held as opposed to those who were not? This is not something that we can very easily study, but Skeels and Dye found a research model to test the hypothesis that children who are held will improve greater than academically, cognitively, intellectually over children who are not held. So they found, this was in the 30s, they found an institution where developmentally delayed children were not routinely held. And so they simply found a random selection of individuals in this institution, and they arranged with volunteers who had grown up in the institution to hold the random selection of individuals. And when comparing these IQ scores, those who were held had a higher IQ than those who were not held on average. It's a significant finding. We can gather that you would not be the person you are today if someone didn't love you, someone didn't hold you and care for you. And the Harlow, Harry and Margaret Harlow studied monkeys, and their question was, if a human baby had a choice to be held as opposed to eat, what would they choose? Now, this is not something that we could study. We can't ethically deprive human babies of food, but they did justify depriving rhesus monkeys. And they simply gave rhesus monkeys who were separated from their parents at birth. They found these monkeys and gave them a choice between a created surrogate with a bottle. It was kind of wired, and it was cold, it was not soft to touch, and then a surrogate that was cloth covered and warm. And so the monkeys constantly and consistently chose the contact comfort from the warm surrogate as opposed to that which had a bottle. Another interesting study in more recent years, since the development of PET scans. Socialization actually begins before the baby is born. A baby hears its mother's voice, and this creates, we could say, a type of cognitive comfort when you take a newborn baby and play a recording of a random female's voice. There's no significant reaction when given a brain scan, a PET scan. However, when you play the recording of the mother, even if the face of the child does not show excitement, the baby's brain begins to light up. The baby recognizes its mother's voice even from the womb, and there's statistically significant amount of neurological reactivity. So it's important that babies in the womb hear kind, gentle words, not yelling. And that gets into my child psychology course. But in some, the sociologists are going to argue that society makes us human. And this extends, sociologists argue that we are who we are mentally and in terms of our identity from socialization. So a very famous symbolic interactionist, Charles Horton Cooley, argued that we are who we are because of socialization. And this is something that he called the looking glass self. When we walk into a room, we imagine how we appear to others. We do this by interpreting their reactions, and we develop a self-concept accordingly. Now, this is a lifelong process, and I have said over the years, what I think you think affects what I think. I'll say that again. What I think you think affects what I think. Mead has sometimes been referred to as the father of symbolic interactionism and is very prominent in the American thought process of sociology. But Mead said that children go through 3 stages in the development of the self: the imitation phase, the play phase, and the games phase. And each of these coordinating with a child's cognitive development. So as children are more capable of taking on another person's point of view, then they begin to develop in terms of their mind. So Mead would say that your mind is a product of socialization, because as you grow in your ability to think abstractly, then you begin to develop in what he would call the generalized other. So if you walk into a job interview, your dress, your preparation, all of it really is based on a guess of what you think people want to hear. And Mead would say that we're constantly in our mental process making these kind of educated guesses about we say what we think is appropriate, what we think, and it's all based on a generalized other. What the group thinks about the individual takes on multiple roles, and this is dependent on our ability to think abstractly. We are also socialized into our emotions. Ekman says there are 6 basic global emotions, but the expression of emotion differs from culture to culture. You can discuss this, think of this as the culture within. I oftentimes ask my students, is there any emotion you are not allowed to express? Males are oftentimes negatively sanctioned for being too emotional. Perhaps females negatively sanctioned for being too vocal or boisterous or aggressive or messy. And so this leads us to gender messages. I have oftentimes in my classes over the years asked this question: to be male, I must blank, right? If you're male. To be female, I must blank. And I want you to sort of fill in the blank here according to the messages that you received. Everybody receives gender messages. These sort of gender role expectations. And if you think about the gender role expectations that you received growing up from your parents and from your peer group and from the media, they impact us. And so we can take an inventory. What sort of gender messages did you receive, and were these the same? Did your peers have a different set of expectations? When we think about agents of socialization, we have to think of the family, school and peer groups, religion, daycare, and the workplace. Take an inventory to how each of these impacted you. Children who are raised in daycare typically read and speak sooner than those who do not. However, children who are not in daycare report a stronger attachment to the parents. They are spending more time during the day with their mom, which fosters emotional regularity and some other emotional benefits. So there is a give and take. Interestingly enough, kids in daycare learn to fight sooner. And this is not being facetious. This is true. Research proves that they're going to use more